On June 2nd, 2018, a man rushed into a police station in Taipei, Taiwan. With an air of familiarity, he headed straight to the department he needed and reported a case. It turned out that he was Mr. Gao, a 60-year-old former police officer who had recently retired after serving in the force for 40 years. On that day, Mr. Gao filed a missing person report for his daughter and earnestly pleaded for assistance from his former colleagues. The missing individual was his 30-year-old daughter, Gao Sheng-un. In fact, leveraging his years of experience, the father had already been conducting his own investigation. He had tracked his daughter's movements over time and had a suspect in mind. The last time his daughter was seen was on May 31st at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She had left the house with her laptop, saying, "Dad, I am off to work on the event poster." However, she did not return home even late into the night. Mr. Gao called her multiple times, but there was no answer. Later, he realized that she had inadvertently left her cell phone at home. Such instances had occurred before, but usually when she was just stepping out in front of the house for a short while. Nevertheless, during those times, knowing her father would worry, she always borrowed a friend's or an acquaintance's phone to call him. However, she had never been unreachable for an entire day. Mr. Gao contacted her friends and visited places she frequently went to, such as the library, art museum, and cafe. But her whereabouts remained unknown. After thoroughly searching the neighborhood, he returned home, his eyes falling on the phone his daughter had left behind. He wondered if there could be any clue on it. Checking her messages and social media, he uncovered something suspicious. Since May 26th, just a few days prior, his daughter had been consistently exchanging messages with a man on Facebook. His identity is that of 35-year-old Bochen. This individual has a rather unusual background. In a park in Taipei, he constructed a large cabin and was teaching indigenous cultural experiences and archery. In his own way, he had carved out an identity for himself. Hence, he took on the role of a teacher. 2 days before her disappearance, on the 28th, the daughter, Gao Xiang-un, learned archery from him. Then, upon seeing this message, it appeared that Chen Bochen had requested her to create a poster for an indigenous event. As a result, the two arranged to meet on the day of her disappearance, the 31st, to discuss this matter. On June 1st, one day after the daughter went missing, her father went directly to the park where the cabin was located and met Chen Bochen. That is when he learned of Chen's identity. Chen opened the door wide, inviting him to look around the cabin. At that moment, a familiar object caught the father's eye. It was his daughter's laptop. The fact that an item she had taken with her on the day she disappeared was there indicated that her last known whereabouts were at this very location. Therefore, he demanded an explanation as to why his daughter's laptop was there. To this, Chen Bochen changed his story, saying, "Ah, I remember she briefly stopped by yesterday." He then proceeded to share a very peculiar story, suggesting, "Oh, she did come here. They followed those rainbows. Being a native myself, I know them well. They are nudists and genuinely dangerous. They use wild camps as bait to lure young children and supposedly engage in group sexual activities at night." It was an eerie tip-off from the moment I heard it. These rainbows that Chen Bochen mentioned are, well, rainbows. What this means is an indigenous group in Taiwan. As you might be listening to this, you may wonder, does Taiwan have indigenous people? I came to know about this for the first time through this case as well. Before the massive migration of the Han people from China to this place, there were originally different ethnic groups living on the land of Taiwan. They are culturally and linguistically rooted in the Polynesian Maori people of the South Pacific. To put it simply, they are like the tribes depicted in the Disney animation Moana. Anyway, upon hearing such an unimaginable and horrific tip-off, the father, determined to rescue his daughter immediately, heads to where the rainbows are living together. He met with them one by one, asking if they had seen his daughter, but somehow he could not gather any significant information. Initially, he suspected they were hiding his daughter and lying about it. However, the more conversations he had, the more something seemed off. Contrary to Chen's statements about nudists and group activities, these individuals were actually very ordinary and innocent people. The claims about nudism were unfounded. Only then did Gao, the father, begin to wonder, have I been deceived? He realized that Chen might have lied to divert his attention. Enraged, Mr. Gao started using all his connections to find out exactly what kind of person Chen was and began to investigate him. In reality, Chen was an ordinary office worker who had been working in a sales position at an insurance company until recently. However, about 3 months ago, he suddenly began claiming that he was a descendant of the Seedic tribe, an indigenous group from Taiwan, and that he would carry on their culture by teaching archery. The Seedic tribe mentioned here is one of the 16 indigenous tribes of Taiwan. They are a small ethnic group with a population of less than 10,000 people. To provide a bit more context, during the 1930s, under Japanese colonial rule, there was an armed resistance incident. At this time, the bravery of the Seedic, known for their archery skills, became widely recognized among the Taiwanese people. Additionally, in modern times, a film depicting the Seedic's resistance was a hit in 2011, further establishing the Seedic as a symbol of resistance and a warrior tribe. Returning to Chen, he had been fond of archery since childhood and was fascinated by Seedic culture. However, his fascination grew to the point where he began to believe that he had Seedic blood in him. Although this was not true, he one day began claiming to be a descendant of the Seedic and started teaching indigenous culture and archery. In that cabin, as later revealed, it was claimed that he worked for an insurance company. Since he was not earning much money, it was all a lie made up after watching a movie. However, as you can see from the photos, this Chen is a tall and handsome man in his 30s. People were excited because such an attractive man was supposedly working on our cultural preservation project. Some even sought out his lectures intentionally. Among those people was Gao Seong-un, the daughter of Mr. Gao. Mr. Gao, who had gathered this information, realized this was a false reputation and never accepted it. More importantly, he needed to find a connection to his daughter to locate her. Thus, Mr. Gao personally started lingering around the cabin to gather even the smallest piece of evidence. During this time, he discovered a CCTV camera positioned in a corner of the area that could provide a crucial clue. However, there was a problem. It was impossible for an ordinary citizen to access that CCTV footage. Only the police could do so. Therefore, on the next day, June 2nd, as soon as daylight broke, he went to the police to file a missing person report. The investigation proceeded more swiftly due to the request of a former police officer. Soon, the results from the CCTV footage were revealed, clearly showing that his daughter had come to this place. At 1 o'clock in the morning on June 1st, it captured his daughter leaving the cabin, using a nearby restroom, and then going back inside. However, there was no footage showing her exiting the cabin. In the blind spot of the CCTV, does it mean she is still trapped inside if she has not come out? Come to think of it, when her father was constantly lingering around that cabin, there was nothing particularly suspicious. From what I could see, Chen seemed to spend most of his time in the cabin, but at night he would call over his girlfriend, and they would sleep together. However, if he had kidnapped the daughter and kept her inside, it seems unlikely that he would have allowed outsiders in. Then it is possible, although ominous, that he may have already committed murder. At this point, Mr. Gao devised a plan. He had his second daughter, who had a voice similar to Gao Seong-un, make a phone call pretending to be her. She said, "Hello, it is me, teacher," in a voice resembling her sister's. However, Chen did not seem flustered at all. He replied, "Hey, where are you right now? Your parents are really worried. They are asking you to contact them soon." After hanging up, he posted news of the disappearance on his social media, actively investigating witness accounts and spreading the word. Upon seeing these actions, it seemed as though he was unrelated to Gao Seong-eun's disappearance. On June 9th, the 10th day since the disappearance, neither the father nor the police in charge had found any concrete evidence. Although it was difficult to admit, the golden time had already passed. With no signs of life, it was concluded that she was likely deceased. However, her father could not possibly give up. Mr. Gao sought help from a private organization and actively used detection dogs to search for the body. It is 2 o'clock in the morning on June 10th. A search team and detection dogs raid this cabin. It is as if they descended upon the cabin in the dead of night. But how did Chen Bochen react at this moment? He behaved like a true gentleman, saying, "Oh my, it must be so hard for you at this hour. I am really tired, so I will actively cooperate with the investigation." He willingly opened the cabin door. This behavior left the civilian investigators slightly baffled and surprised. He behaved as if he had nothing to do with the incident. On the one hand, there was also a sense that he was excessively trying to prove his innocence. Shortly afterward, the detection dogs entered the cabin. They sniffed around at various things and then suddenly began to bark fiercely at one spot. That spot was precisely where a green icebox was placed in the corner. The investigators immediately thought, "This is it," and attempted to open it to check inside. At this moment, Chen Bochen abruptly blocked the icebox with his body and changed his demeanor. "Excuse me, gentlemen. You do realize that doing this without a warrant is illegal, do you not? You should leave before I report this. This is my home," he said. Only moments ago, he had not mentioned anything like that and had declared his willingness to cooperate with the investigation. But that disposition vanished completely. Upon hearing about this situation, the father was informed and persuaded the officer in charge that night. There was definitely something there. Please investigate. The next day, accompanied by detectives, they went to the cabin early in the morning. They thought they had caught him and opened the door, but the icebox was already gone. Chen Bochen casually said, "Oh, that? Did a thief break in at dawn? It disappeared." He said this without changing his expression, so calmly that it was maddening. Ultimately, the investigation hit another wall. How could they get a confession out of this man? The police, after much deliberation, summoned Chen Bochen, the prime suspect, for questioning. They began a thorough interrogation. In fact, the police had already secured very important witnesses and evidence. It turned out that on the night of the incident, the 31st, 2 other men visited the cabin besides Chen Bochen and his daughter, Gao Seong-eun. They arrived at around 6 in the evening at the invitation of Chen Bochen. These individuals witnessed Gao Seong-eun there. They said they all enjoyed a meal and drinks together, engaging in conversation. Particularly, on that day, they testified that Gao Seong-eun seemed to get intoxicated more quickly by mixing wine and beer. The drinking session among the 4 continued for some time. Then, Gao Seong-eun was the first to fall asleep from drinking. The 2 men decided it was time to leave, saying they would head out, and they left the cabin. It was around 1 o'clock in the early morning when Gao Seong-eun finally woke up and said, "I am going to the restroom," before stepping out of the cabin. Her visit to the restroom was captured on the CCTV earlier. However, the issue arises after this point. Chen Bochen claimed that since mixed gender accommodation was prohibited at the cabin, he sent Gao Seong-eun home right away. But here is the thing. Every night, this person would call his girlfriend over to stay there with him, which makes his claim completely unbelievable. Despite this, Chen Bochen insisted in more detail, claiming, "I definitely saw Gao Seong-eun riding a public bicycle home." However, in Taiwan, public bicycles require a transportation card to be tagged at the machine for use. Gao Seong-eun had left her transportation card at home that day. Although it is possible to buy a new card, it requires mobile phone verification, and her mobile phone was also at home that day. Thus, nothing adds up. The police were questioning, "Really? Where is that rental place located? When pressed further, Chen Bochen clammed up again. It was clear he was deceiving the police with such a flimsy lie. He could not hide his nervousness each time he told the lie. At one point, he complained about how hot it was, fanning himself and asking for the air conditioning to be turned on. This shows his shamelessness. It seemed difficult to extract a confession from him easily. At this point, the police offered him two final choices. If you truly have nothing to do with this case, you can just go home now. However, if your lie is exposed, you will face aggravated punishment. If you do not want that, we will give you 3 hours. Go home with us. Take some time to think and calmly return to the police station on your own to confess. If you confess, your sentence will be reduced. It appears the police thought that coercion would not work, so they decided to try persuasion. They suggested he go home, organize his belongings, take some time, and then confess. After some contemplation, Chen Bochen accepted the second option. He returned to his cabin in the police car. However, what followed demonstrated his pitiful behavior, revealing much about his character. He made a phone call, during which he praised himself, and when the police car arrived, he gathered his female acquaintances in one place. So, when he arrived home with the police, these women were waiting there. He quietly and calmly packed his belongings. However, the gathered women began to criticize the police as if they were defending a cult leader, questioning the authority of the police to do such things. They accused the officers of abusing their power to arrest this good person, hurling insults and even spitting. Some of them even tried to hold on to Chen Bochen as he was about to get into the police car, leading to a physical altercation with the officers. This is illegal, of course, and they were eventually arrested for obstruction of justice. Throughout the entire situation, Chen Bochen seemed to watch calmly, almost as if he was enjoying the spectacle. It appeared that he was quite popular among women. Moreover, being a narcissist, he was absorbed in his own sense of superiority. As you may know, narcissists typically do not admit their faults, lie frequently, and engage in self-pity and gaslighting. Until the moment of his arrest, he wanted to flaunt his superiority by manipulating those women. After all the drama, once he returned to the police station, Chen Bochen finally revealed the truth of that day. On June 1st, at around 1 a.m, Gao Xiongwun, who had been drinking, fell asleep. She woke up and went to the bathroom. She wanted to go home, but seemed unable to properly control her body, so she lay down for a moment and fell back asleep. About an hour later, feeling a sense of discomfort, she opened her eyes and, to her surprise, found Chen Bochen lying next to her. At that time, Chen Bochen thought that Gao Xiongwun liked him and wanted to be intimate with him, which is why he believed she remained at the cabin. And then he demands to have sexual relations. However, Gao Xiongwun firmly refuses until the end, and even says to him, "Sir, are you not a married man?" Indeed, Chen Bochen is separated from his wife for several months now. He is married. It is said that he brought home only a meager salary, spending all of it on entertainment, and even resorting to domestic violence against his wife, making it impossible for the marriage to continue. Chen Bochen is known to have strong narcissistic tendencies. When his wife criticized him and demanded a divorce, his pride was severely wounded. Even after the separation, the anger lingered within him. But now, in this situation, Gao Xiongwun, whom he believed stayed, because she liked him and wanted to have sexual relations, unexpectedly rejects him? Hey, you are drunk and staying at my place. Is it not obvious? Are you lying to me? How dare someone like you reject me? Do you know who I am? This was not just the anger of that day, but the culmination of the anger that had been building up over time. At that moment, Gao Xiongwun gets up and starts packing her things, intending to go home. Suddenly, Chen Bochen forcefully grabbed the back of Gao Xiongwun's neck and pushed her onto the bed. He restrained her by pressing down firmly on her back and shoulders with his knee. Although she tried desperately to get away, Chen Bochen, overcome with anger, held her even more tightly and became increasingly aggressive. In a moment of lost control, he began to strangle her. This caused Gao Xiong'un to lose consciousness, leading Chen Bochen to believe that she had passed away. Afterward, he continued to act on his impulses. In reality, at that moment, the victim was still alive, though only barely. Had she received medical attention right away, she might have survived. Ultimately, she passed away during the attack. With the situation as it was, Chen Bochen stuffed her body into a cooler next to the bed and went to sleep. The very next day, her father, Mr. Gao, a former police officer, came to the tavern looking for his daughter. At that time, Chen Bochen managed to send him away with vague explanations. But 2 days later, the police arrived as well. The body inside the cooler had started to decompose, releasing an unmistakable odor. Realizing he needed to act before further suspicion arose, he quickly decided to dispose of the body. Chen Bochen purchased a tarp, a large quantity of plastic bags, and 3 knives, each about 15 centimeters long. He spent the night dismembering the body, cutting it into pieces over a span of 7 hours. He then divided the parts into bags and suitcases. Once everything was prepared, at 5 o'clock in the morning, he gathered the bundles and took advantage of a blind spot in the closed-circuit television surveillance to leave the cabin. He rode his motorcycle to a place called Yangmingshan, located about 20 kilometers north of Taipei. Chen Bochen confessed to abandoning the body there. Upon hearing this, the police immediately rushed to Yangmingshan. After an exhaustive 8-hour search, they were fortunately able to locate all the dismembered parts of the body. Unusually, the body was discarded in 2 locations. At one site, there were the arms, head, and torso. Then, 2 kilometers away, the legs were found at another location. Another peculiar aspect was that the eyes, nose, and mouth of the corpse were sealed with white tape. This is said to have a ritualistic significance in Taiwan, where such superstitions are observed. It is meant to prevent the spirit of the tragically deceased victim from returning to visit the living. In any case, the investigation into the body began immediately, and as the forensic pathologist pieced together the fragments, they made a horrifying discovery. The victim's left breast and genital area had been precisely excised. Those parts were completely missing, not merely degraded. The police returned to Chen Bochen and interrogated him. Why did you excise the breast and genital area? Where are they? This elicited an unexpected reaction. Chen Bochen appeared to be suppressing a smile, as if amused, and even casually whistled. He showed no intention of answering. It was maddening. However, shortly thereafter, a message came through that these body parts had been found at the perpetrator's residence. While searching Chen Bochen's house, the police discovered a dismembered body part on the balcony. It was found inside a zipper bag placed under a flower pot. The severed part was immersed in salt and alum. Here, alum is a substance used to coagulate proteins, which, simply put, means that when salt and alum are sprinkled on a corpse, it slows down decomposition and dries the body, leading to a process called adipocure formation. This method is typically used for making animal specimens. It turns out that Chen Bochen had been interested in animal dissection and specimen creation from a young age. He would research on his own and create specimens himself, acquiring nearly expert-level knowledge. In essence, after committing the murder, he intended to preserve parts of the victim's chest and genitals as a sort of macabre memento or trophy. It is truly horrifying. Now, the case is reaching its final stages. With his confession and the discovery of the corpse, all that remains is the judgment of the law. However, another unexpected challenge arises. At the first trial held in August 2019, standing next to the perpetrator was the infamous Huang Ji-ho, known as the Devil's Advocate of Taiwan. Huang Ji-ho is a prominent attorney with a reputation for helping even those almost certain to receive the death penalty get their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. His presence made both the victim's family and the prosecution nervous. but they had already secured a confession from Chen Bochen. They were confident that the death penalty would be handed down effortlessly. However, as soon as the trial commenced, Chen Bochen suddenly began to cry, as if overwhelmed with sorrow. He claimed that he had no idea how the victim died. He said that he had been coerced into giving a false confession by the police. Furthermore, he claimed to know the real culprit, accusing someone named Eric. He stated that he only helped Eric clean up after the crime. In an attempt to evade responsibility, he employs every conceivable trick. As evidence, it was previously mentioned that the body was found dismembered in 2 different locations. He claims, "See, I disposed of one part, and Eric disposed of the other." The prosecutors, weary of his lies, are determined to uncover the truth. Firstly, Chen Bochen confessed in his initial statement that he strangled the victim. However, during the trial, he suddenly changed his story, claiming he did not know how she died. Yet, the autopsy revealed that the victim had a fractured hyoid bone, which clearly indicates death by strangulation. If Eric, whoever that may be, were the real culprit, how could Chen Bochen have accurately described the method of murder? Furthermore, Chen Bochen provided a detailed account of how he subdued Gao Xiong-un by forcefully pressing her shoulder and back with his knee. In fact, the victim's body had a bruise approximately 30 centimeters in length, stretching from the right shoulder blade down to the waist, which precisely matched his confession. No matter how you look at it, his story is self-contradictory. To make matters worse, who is this Eric? Even Chen Bochen admits he does not know who Eric is. He claims to know the name but cannot describe his appearance or provide a phone number. What is this nonsense? Remember, he attended a drinking party on the day of the incident, accompanied by 2 acquaintances. 2 acquaintances were also puzzled, questioning, "Eric? I do not know him well." It seemed he was creating a fictional character until the end. His refusal to straightforwardly admit to his crimes, coupled with his evasive lies, ultimately led the court in the first trial to sentence him to death. However, he immediately appealed. Huang Jiho, the defense attorney, realized that they could not avoid the murder charge and decided to change his strategy. He admitted, yes, he committed murder, but he turned himself in. Because he surrendered himself, he should receive leniency. Additionally, he argued that the body samples kept on the balcony were not souvenirs, but rather intended to be buried later as a gesture of respect for the deceased. Even from our perspective, this does not make sense, but it appears that Huang Jiho was a rather cunningly skilled lawyer. Regarding this verdict, the sentence was reduced from the death penalty to life imprisonment. By October of the year 2020, the Supreme Court confirmed the life imprisonment sentence. Naturally, the victim's family was outraged by this decision. After all, Chen Bochen did not initially surrender himself. It was through police investigation and persuasion that he confessed and accompanied the police. They felt the Taiwanese judicial system had entirely failed. The family of the deceased cried out that their daughter was killed twice. They shouted, and even the police appealed to the Supreme Court, throwing eggs to express the injustice. However, the final verdict did not easily change. Following the incident, the perpetrator, Chen Bochen, published a book while in prison. Upon hearing this, I felt my anger rising again. Do you know what the title was? The Murderer's Innocence. According to what I heard, he boasted to his fellow inmates that he would live comfortably for the rest of his life with the proceeds from the book's publication. A retired former police officer, the victim's father Gao, personally tracked his daughter's disappearance, ultimately uncovering the dramatic revelation of the perpetrator's existence. However, Chen Bochen seems to be living contently in prison, apparently satisfied with his current situation. The pain that feels like a nail driven into the heart of the victim's father will not easily disappear as long as the perpetrator remains alive. Stay with me, the second story is coming up, and it's just as shocking. Let me know in the comments what you think about the first story. Underneath Moscow, there are numerous small towns that rarely make it to the news. Among them is a modest town called Shatura, with a population of 37,000. The town is mainly known for its furniture production, and during summer, the surrounding peat bogs frequently catch fire. However, in the spring of 2015, Shatura gained unexpected attention from anyone following the news. The quiet town, nestled between forests and lakes, became the scene of a shocking incident. A local primary school teacher, who had dutifully served for nearly 30 years, suddenly found herself at the center of a notorious crime. This is a story of obsession and unclear relations between an adult teacher and a mere child, a story that remains a subject of debate to this day. Today, I will present this story from two different perspectives, and the decision of whom to believe will be left to the audience. Back in 1963, a girl named Yulia Simonova was born into a family of a German language teacher and a factory technician. Yulia was raised under strict conditions. Her mother was the dominant figure in the household, stern and authoritative. She imposed heavy pressure on Yulia, demanding that all her time be dedicated solely to studying. The young girl was forbidden from meeting with friends, watching television, or even going outside for a walk. When Yulia pleaded with her mother, she was often met with a dismissive reply, "Stop wasting time on nonsense." Locals have much to say about Yulia and her mother. "We knew Yulia since she was a child. She grew up scared. Her mother constantly bullied her, giving her no freedom at all." At school, Yulia's mother wasn't a pleasant teacher either. She constantly yelled at students, sent them out of the classroom, and would immediately give a failing grade if something went wrong. Some parents even transferred their children to other schools just to avoid having her as their teacher. In her free time, not occupied by studies, Yulia pursued creative interests, particularly enjoying music. When she told her mother that she wanted to dedicate her adult life to music, it caused a major scandal at home. Her mother loudly insisted that Yulia follow in her footsteps and become a teacher. The mother eventually got her way. After finishing school, Yulia enrolled in a pedagogical university, and by the age of 22 had secured a job as a primary school teacher in one of the schools in Shatura. Despite her new career, Yulia didn't abandon her hobby. She had a real talent for playing the accordion and frequently performed at school concerts. Before long, fortune smiled on her again. A music teacher position became available at the school, and Yulia immediately took it. She finally got the job she had always dreamed of. However, Yulia's personal life wasn't as smooth. Her first marriage was to a longtime admirer. Soon after, they had a daughter, but in 1993, after several years of marriage, her husband left her. Not grieving for long, Yulia entered a new relationship within 6 months, and in 1995 she gave birth to a son. But like her first marriage, this one also didn't last, and by the early 2000s, the couple divorced. Determined to try a different approach, Yulia started dating Igor Ustimov, a simple man who worked in Moscow on a rotational basis. Their relationship was rather unusual. They lived separately, but they would visit each other almost every day. They never formalized their relationship. According to Igor, Yulia was afraid of betrayal due to her past failed relationships. In 2006, Yulia had an overwhelming workload, juggling music lessons and teaching primary school. That same year, a 6-year-old boy named Ivan Sitnikov enrolled in school, and the teacher immediately noticed his unusual talent. Yulia Alexeyevna, as the teacher was to be formally addressed, frequently called Ivan to the front of the class, giving him excellent grades regardless of his answers. Of course, Ivan's classmates noticed this unusual behavior. One of Ivan's friends recalls, "She was always slipping him money, even though he didn't ask for it. But he didn't refuse either. She singled him out from the whole class. I remember how she'd take him to Moscow at her own expense, sometimes to the cinema, sometimes to museums. I thought she was just being kind." By 2010, Yulia Alexeyevna had reached the peak of her career, earning the title of Teacher of the Year twice and becoming a teacher of the highest qualification. That same year, Ivan finished primary school, and Yulia decided to change schools. However, this didn't stop her from continuing to see the boy. A few months before her departure, Yulia met Ivan's parents, praised the boy, and spoke highly of his talents. She even offered to tutor him for free, preparing him for various exams and competitions, all in the name of unlocking his full potential. His parents were surprised by her enthusiasm, but agreed to let her teach him. Once Ivan moved to middle school, his grades noticeably declined. Teachers were puzzled as to how he had managed to maintain such high marks previously. It soon became clear that Yulia had been pressuring the teachers to inflate his grades. She even approached his new teachers. But this time, her influence over his academic performance didn't work. In addition to her academic interest, Yulia showered Ivan with various gifts. As Ivan grew older, Yulia's gifts became more extravagant and expensive. At first, she gave him various toys, but by the 5th grade, she handed him a mobile phone. According to the parents of Ivan's classmates back then, not every adult had a cell phone, let alone a child. People were baffled, especially considering that Yulia couldn't even afford proper shoes for her own son, yet she was showering another child with such expensive gifts. But that was far from the most shocking gesture. In 2014, Yulia stunned everyone by giving Ivan a scooter worth 65,000 rubles for his 14th birthday. It was hard to believe how a humble teacher managed to save up that amount. Even Ivan's parents, who seemingly didn't see anything unusual in Yulia's behavior, were surprised. However, they eventually returned the money to Yulia to cover the cost of the scooter. Despite all the tutoring and coaching from Yulia, Ivan's performances in various competitions and academic Olympiads were unsuccessful. Whether his parents ever questioned why their supposedly talented son, who spent so much time with Yulia Alexeyevna, wasn't achieving great results remains unknown. What is known is that during the summer of 2014, Yulia strongly advised Ivan's parents not to allow their son to get distracted by girls, claiming it would interfere with his studies. With the start of the new school year, there was a noticeable chill in the relationship between the teacher and the student. Ivan began distancing himself from Yulia, increasingly refusing her gifts, even as she continued to raise the value of each one. He also started ignoring her phone calls. The final blow for Yulia came when, at the beginning of the next year, Ivan entered his first romantic relationship. For a while, Ivan successfully avoided meeting Yulia, and she learned of his new relationship through mutual acquaintances. In February, she accidentally spotted Ivan and his girlfriend at a bus stop, holding hands affectionately. Despite witnesses being present, Yulia caused a scene, cursing at Ivan's girlfriend and even spitting at her. Shortly after this incident, offensive graffiti aimed at Ivan began appearing on the walls of buildings he frequented. His parents tried to find out who was responsible for the insults, but were unsuccessful. In February of that same year, Yulia waited for Ivan, hoping to reconcile with him. She handed him 5,000 rubles, but the boy gave the money back, telling her that he fully understood what Yulia Alexeyevna was trying to achieve, but it wasn't going to happen. He was in love with Dasha, and their feelings were mutual. There was no chance they would break up. Everyone who knew Yulia said that after this incident, she wasn't herself. She became distracted and unable to focus on anything specific, which began affecting her work. Nobody knew what was going through her mind, but at that time, Yulia was already contemplating revenge. One day, she came to a grim realization. If she couldn't have Ivan, then no one else should. In early April, with this thought consuming her, Yulia approached a friend, a former professional athlete who now worked as a wrestling coach. The man's name was Nikolai. Yulia poured out all her pain and frustrations to him, and at the end, she made a shocking proposal. She offered him 100,000 rubles to, as she put it, rid the world of the ungrateful person who had trampled on her feelings. Moreover, Yulia insisted that she wanted to be present at the moment of the murder, to fully savor her revenge. Nikolai, stunned and utterly unprepared for such a conversation, listened carefully. He then told her that he wouldn't personally carry out such an act, but knew someone who could take on the job. Yulia agreed, and after their conversation, Nikolai headed straight to the police. The very next day, Yulia met with the supposed hitman, who, in her mind, was a former convict. In reality, he was an undercover police officer. They discussed all the details, and Yulia agreed to all the conditions: 100,000 rubles in cash, and she wouldn't be present at the time of the killing. Her mood noticeably improved after this arrangement. Yulia seemed to float on air, filled with anticipation of her revenge. Everyone around her noticed the change. Her colleagues, including Igor Ustimov, with whom she had never fully settled down. Yulia called the hitman several times, urging him to hurry, A few days later, the call came in. The job was done. Ecstatic, Yulia hurried to meet the hitman, ready to hand over the money. But as soon as she transferred the 100,000 rubles, she was arrested. Despite the overwhelming evidence, including recordings of their conversations, Yulia continued to deny her guilt, demanding her immediate release. Word of the incident quickly spread throughout the town. Many residents were outraged and shocked, especially since Yulia Alexeyevna had taught their children as well. Some people couldn't comprehend how such a relationship between a teacher and her student could have developed, while others outright denied that such a thing could have happened. One of those skeptics was Igor Ustamov, who shared his thoughts in an interview. "I can live with the idea that she wanted him dead, but I don't believe she was in love with the boy. That's just impossible." Journalists conducted a lengthy interview with Igor, and here are some of his remarks. "Yulia is a rather fragile woman. She was betrayed by 2 ex-husbands, and they completely shattered her trust. After that, she became terrified of betrayal. She never even agreed to marry me, despite me proposing twice. Besides her job, she often performed at events, and even with such a busy schedule, she still found time to visit me almost every day and take care of her sick mother. She barely slept more than 5 hours a night. Do you really think she had the time for something as ridiculous as chasing after a young boy? All those rumors about gifts, they're just that, rumors." You see, Yulia wanted to stand out. She wanted to show everyone that she had a talent for discovering gifted children, and that's why she chose Ivan. She saw potential in him and began working with him, taking him to various events. Naturally, she had to keep in contact with his parents. She needed their permission to take him places and things like that. The mistake his mother made was inviting Yulia to Ivan's birthday. She thought it was just a way of thanking the teacher for all her hard work, but Yulia believed they were trying to befriend her. Of course, Yulia showed up with gifts, and that's where all these rumors about expensive presents started. This went on for 4 years. For 4 years, Yulia believed she was truly befriending Ivan's family, but in reality, she was only valuable to them for helping Ivan with his studies. She tried to help not only the boy but his family as well, even providing money for an operation when his mother was sick. Yulia was naive, Igor explained. She just wanted to be friends. On her desk, there was a photograph of Ivan in a heart-shaped frame. But it wasn't because she was in love with him. It was a gift, and she kept it as a memento. Even the story about the scooter wasn't as it seemed. The boy had been dreaming of one for a long time, and when his parents took Yulia with them to pick one out, they realized they were a few thousand rubles short. Yulia simply lent them the money, and they later returned it. In the summer of 2014, Yulia was hospitalized. It was a difficult experience. Her veins were so hard to find that injections were almost given in her palms. While in the hospital, she came to a heartbreaking realization. She was no longer important to the Sitnikov family. None of them visited her, and they didn't even call to check on her. After that, she decided never to reach out to them first again. The Sitnikovs didn't congratulate her on September 1st, on Teacher's Day, or even on her birthday. Then one day, she passed Ivan on the street and he didn't even greet her. Yulia had a complete breakdown. She couldn't understand how a family for whom she had done so much could forget her so completely. In February 2015, Ivan's mother finally tried to contact Yulia, sending her text messages. In one of them, she wrote that Ivan had gotten into trouble and was now at the police station, and they needed money to pay a fine. Yulia was outraged, forgotten when they didn't need her, but suddenly remembered when they did. She didn't give them any money and refused to reply to the texts. When asked if there had been a sexual relationship between Yulia and Ivan, Igor confidently stated, "There wasn't." You have to understand, she has a different mindset. She spent almost all of her time with primary school students. For her, the entire topic of sex was taboo. She would blush at the mere mention of it. She treated Ivan like her own son. After her arrest, Yulia became ill, and an ambulance had to be called. By the time she appeared in court, she was under heavy medication and might have said anything. I can believe she may have wanted to order the boy's death, but to suggest it was motivated by sexual reasons? Absolutely not. Regardless of what Yulia's relationship with Ivan truly was, in May 2015, she was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. It was soon revealed that she wasn't fully well and was diagnosed with a mental disorder. Because of this, She was found unfit to stand trial and was sent for mandatory treatment in a psychiatric hospital. To this day, Yulia is still undergoing treatment, while her family waits anxiously for her recovery and return home. And now, let's head to South Korea, where a chilling crime took place. In this case, one of the victims was a young child, and the tragic events that unfolded shocked the entire nation. On the night of August 22, 2019, around 11 p.m., two men entered an old apartment building in the Gwanak district of Seoul, visibly worried. They were headed to the apartment of their daughter and sister, Choi, whom they hadn't been able to contact since the previous day. One of the men was Choi's father, and the other was her older brother. When they reached the apartment door, they knocked, calling out for Choi, but there was no response. The brother immediately called Choi's husband, who was not at home at the time. During the call, her husband provided the code to unlock the door. With that, the father and brother were able to enter the apartment. Inside, there was silence and darkness. The apartment was neatly organized, as was typical of Choi's meticulous nature, but they found it strange that all the windows were tightly covered with curtains. Even stranger was the fact that the bedroom door was locked. When they cautiously opened it, they were met with a horrifying scene no one could have anticipated. Choi and her 6-year-old son, June, were lying lifeless on the floor. The scene was so gruesome it was hard to describe. Both of them were lying on the bed, surrounded by an overwhelming amount of blood. Their necks had been slashed so severely that it was difficult to count the exact number of wounds. Both victims had suffered vicious attacks to the neck. The autopsy results revealed that Choi had been stabbed 11 times, while her son June had been stabbed 3 times. The wounds were inflicted with such force that the knife had pierced through the mattress. Both had sustained fatal injuries that severed their airways, likely leaving them unable to even scream before they died. Choi and June were both in their pajamas, and there were no signs of a struggle, indicating that the killer attacked them while they were asleep. Who could have committed such a monstrous crime? There were no signs of forced entry or robbery. Additionally, security cameras around the house and the dash cams in the area didn't reveal anything suspicious. The only significant detail was the excessive violence found on Choi's body, and the fact that June's face had been covered with a pillow. This suggested that the killer was familiar with the family and had easy access to the apartment. Clearly, the perpetrator's sole intention was murder. Finding the person who had brutally murdered the mother and her son became an urgent priority. The day before the tragedy, on August 21st at 8:49 p.m., Choi had sent her last message to her family through a messenger app. She was typically active in the family chat, but the next day, August 22nd at 5 p.m., her sister left her a message that Choi never read. This was strange, and at 8:40 p.m., her mother tried calling her but again received no response. This prompted the father and brother, worried by her silence, to go to her apartment that evening. A natural question arises. Why, despite Choi being married, did her family not contact her husband first? The answer lies in the specifics of their family situation. At the time, Choi and her husband Cho were living almost separately. They had married in December 2013, and a year later their son June was born. From the very beginning of their marriage, Cho was deeply involved in ceramic art and fully dedicated himself to his work. This made it difficult for him to contribute to the family's financial life, placing the burden of supporting the family on Choi, who worked at a publishing company. Moreover, Cho often stayed at his workshop, claiming it was necessary for his work, and he rarely came home, only a few times a year. Over time, the relationship between the couple began to deteriorate. Arguments became frequent, and eventually they filed for divorce. At the time of the tragedy, Cho spent most of his time at his workshop, and their life together had almost come to an end. They were essentially living apart. However, during the police investigation, an unexpected fact emerged. On August 21st, the day before the bodies were found, Cho had visited the house. In serious crime investigations, the first people police investigate are the victim's closest relatives, which is a standard procedure. Naturally, the police focused on Cho. Cho, however, maintained his innocence and insisted that he had nothing to do with the murders. He admitted that his relationship with his wife was strained, but according to him, he still visited the house occasionally to see his son. Let's examine his testimony. On August 21st at 8:56 p.m., Cho returned home and found that his wife and son had already eaten dinner. He ate alone late at night. At around 10 p.m., the whole family went to sleep in their shared bedroom. But 3 hours later, at around 1 a.m., Cho woke up. Cho woke up because his son had started talking in his sleep. Cho had always been a light sleeper, and after that he couldn't fall back asleep. He decided it would be better to head to his workshop and try to sleep there. According to his statement, he left the house at 1:35 a.m. At that moment, his wife Choi woke up from his footsteps and told him, "Take the fruit from the fridge," which supported his version of events. At that point, according to Cho, everyone in the house was alive. Surveillance cameras near the house also captured him leaving at that time. However, questions about his testimony soon arose. The autopsy revealed that both Choi and her son June had undigested food in their stomachs. This allowed experts to conclude that they died 1 to 2 hours after eating, but no later than 4 hours after their meal. This finding cast doubt on Cho's statements. He claimed that he came home around 9 p.m. and ate alone because his family had already finished dinner. But if his family died 1 or 2 hours after eating, it meant their deaths occurred before midnight, while Cho was still at home. His account that Choi and June were alive until 1 a.m. no longer matched the forensic evidence. After 41 days of investigation, the police began to view Cho as the primary suspect in the murders of his wife and son. While there was no direct evidence yet linking him to the crime, the investigation uncovered several key details pointing to him. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was the location of the stab wounds on the victims. Choi was lying in bed, facing the wall, with the knife wounds to the left side of her neck, while June had stab wounds on the right side of his neck. These facts led the police to believe that the killer was likely ambidextrous, meaning he could use both hands equally. And Cho, as it turned out, was exactly that. He was left-handed but could easily use both hands. To be more precise, Cho was primarily left-handed. However, due to his work in ceramics, he had developed the ability to skillfully use both hands. This was evidenced by numerous videos of his work that he had once uploaded to his YouTube channel. Upon reviewing these videos, the police became convinced that Cho could indeed be ambidextrous. As for the murder weapon, it was never found. However, surveillance footage from 1:35 a.m. on August 22nd, when Cho was seen leaving the house, showed that he was carrying a bag. The police speculated that the knife could have been inside the bag, which he later hid to cover up the crime. Choi's family had already suspected for some time that Cho might have been involved in her murder. Even when their daughter first went silent, her father and brother initially went to Cho's workshop to see if he knew anything about her whereabouts. His reaction, however, was strange. He answered indifferently that he didn't know where she was, and remained surprisingly calm, despite the fact that his wife hadn't been in contact for more than a day. The most bizarre behavior from Cho emerged after the deaths of Choi and their son were confirmed. He remained shockingly calm and detached, even upon learning of his family's death. One of the police officers involved in the investigation remarked, "I've never encountered a family member of a victim who reacted with such indifference." Moreover, as soon as Cho learned of his wife and son's deaths, the first thing he did was seek legal counsel. This happened even before the official investigation began. The question arose, why did he need a lawyer before the investigation had even started? But that wasn't all. At the funeral of his wife and son, Cho stayed for only 20 minutes before leaving. Just 20 minutes. His behavior was so cold and detached that even his own sister couldn't understand it. When asked about his conduct, Cho explained that the sudden loss of his family didn't give him time to process what had happened. According to him, he was in shock, and that's why he seemed so indifferent. Despite this, Cho continued to deny all accusations. He insisted that there was no evidence linking him to the murders. He maintained his innocence, repeatedly asking, "Where's the proof that I did this?" The police conducted a thorough investigation of his workshop, but found no traces of blood or the murder weapon. However, one crucial piece of evidence did emerge. At the crime scene in the bathroom, traces of Cho's DNA were found. His DNA was discovered on the bath mat in front of the sink and on a towel. The towel was slightly damp, and after being treated with luminol, blood traces were revealed. This suggested that the killer had used the towel to wipe off the blood before placing it in the laundry basket. Cho, however, dismissed this finding, arguing that his DNA being present in their shared home was perfectly normal since he lived there. But the suspicious circumstances continued to pile up. For instance, when Cho returned home on the evening of August 21st, his car's dashcam was turned off, meaning there were no recordings during that time. The next day, Cho bought a new memory card and reactivated the dashcam in his car. However, the police noted that his behavior during the period when the dashcam was off appeared particularly suspicious. At 1:35 a.m., Cho left the house and headed to his workshop, located about 20 minutes away. He didn't leave the workshop until 11:39 a.m., nearly 9 hours later. The police immediately took note of this long time spent at the workshop. Far too long. Investigators began to suspect that Cho might have used the electric kiln in his workshop to dispose of the murder weapon. This kiln, which was used for firing ceramics, could reach temperatures of up to 1,300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to destroy almost any item. The police checked the electricity consumption records for Cho's workshop on the night of the murders and found a sharp spike in power usage at 4 a.m. This indicated that the kiln had been turned on at full capacity at that time. Additionally, just 6 days after the murders, Cho suddenly posted an online ad offering his kiln for sale. This only deepened the suspicions surrounding his behavior. The police quickly responded to Cho's suspicious behavior and seized his kiln for further analysis. Unfortunately, the examination didn't reveal any direct evidence. Despite a wealth of circumstantial evidence pointing to Cho as the prime suspect, no concrete proof was found. This left the case hanging on assumptions and conjecture. The police then began to dig deeper into Cho's possible motives for killing his wife and son. After a thorough investigation, a hidden secret emerged that shed new light on the case. As previously mentioned, Cho's relationship with his wife Choi was far from ideal. From the beginning of their relationship, Choi financially supported Cho. Not only did she cover his creative expenses before their marriage, but even after the wedding, she continued to give him 2 million won every month to fund his work. Additionally, she paid for the rent of his workshop, utilities, tools, and materials. At one point, she even took out a loan to move him into a modern office space of 78 pyong, about 260 square meters, where Cho's workshop was located. Meanwhile, Choi and her son lived in an old, rundown apartment that was on the verge of being condemned. This stark contrast highlighted how selfless Choi had been, supporting her husband and his career at the expense of herself and her son. So what was Cho doing? Cho was far from the image of a caring husband and father. He was cold toward his son, and when his wife expressed her frustrations about this, he would often reply with, "Then let's get a divorce." But soon, an event occurred that became a turning point in their relationship. Choi could no longer tolerate his behavior and constant financial demands. She decided to stop supporting him financially. Choi wrote her husband a long letter, carefully expressing her thoughts. She acknowledged his talent and passion for art, but suggested he find another way to earn money, as supporting his work had become financially unbearable for her. She wrote, "I admire your energy and talent, but it has become very difficult for me to manage financially. Maybe it's time for you to try earning money another way." However, Cho received this message with anger. He felt that his wife didn't respect him as an artist and was deeply offended by her suggestion. In a reply text message, which you see on the screen, he wrote, "So you're saying I can't make money? Do you think my works are just decorative pieces? You say I'm not famous, but who could be better than me in ceramics? You're talking nonsense. I told you before we got married that the most important thing to me is my work." After this incident, Cho stopped living with his wife altogether. Perhaps he no longer needed her support, as she was no longer able to finance him. Could this even be called a marriage, or was it just exploitation? When Choi stopped her financial support, Cho found himself in a difficult situation. He didn't know how to make ends meet and began borrowing money from acquaintances. But unfortunately, this didn't help either. He soon became addicted to horse racing and lost all his savings. Do you know how much he had in his bank account at the time of the tragedy? Just 1,900 won. During this period, Cho learned something that could have been of great interest to him. He was listed as the beneficiary of a 170 million won life insurance policy on his wife. Moreover, Choi's family had transferred 2 commercial buildings to her name, which would also pass to Cho upon her death. This discovery could have given Cho a strong motive for murder, money that could have pulled him out of his financial ruin. Meanwhile, the police continued their investigation and conducted an analysis of Cho's laptop. It turned out that shortly before the murder, he had been actively researching criminal cases involving killings. He was particularly interested in the film The Real Criminal, in which the perpetrator hides the murder weapon, causing the case to hit a dead end. In one key scene of the film, the killer covers the victim's face with a towel and hides their phone under the mattress. You might ask, was this a coincidence or not? After all, at the crime scene, Cho's son's face was covered with a pillow, and his wife's phone was found between the mattress and the bed linens. Coincidence? Unlikely. But that's not all. Now, I'll reveal Cho's biggest secret, one that was hidden from everyone. He had a mistress. Moreover, their relationship began 6 months before his wedding to Choi. After the wedding, Cho essentially lived with this woman in his workshop, as though leading a double life, part of it with his family and the other with his lover. Now it becomes clearer why Cho was rarely home, and why he was so cold toward his wife and son. The police also questioned his lover. She revealed that Cho often expressed regret about his marriage. He even began to doubt that June was his biological son, based on the fact that the boy didn't resemble him. Cho repeatedly mentioned that he wanted to have a paternity test to confirm or deny his fatherhood. However, a test conducted later showed that June was indeed his son. In the end, all these circumstances, financial struggles, a strained relationship with his wife, and the presence of a mistress, led to Cho being charged with murder. In April 2020, the Court of First Instance sentenced Cho to life imprisonment. The court ruled that the likelihood of a third party entering the home was extremely low. The court also noted that financial issues and the conflict with his wife were clear motives for the crime. Cho disagreed with the verdict and filed an appeal. 6 months later, the appellate court upheld the life sentence, affirming most of the findings from the first trial. The court pointed out that the method of the crime, involving the use of both hands, aligned perfectly with Cho's physical abilities. However, Cho filed yet another appeal. In April 2021, the Supreme Court delivered its final verdict, upholding Cho's life sentence. This case became notable for the fact that the prosecution's case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. Despite the absence of the murder weapon and any video recordings from the crime scene, the evidence collected was convincing enough to find Cho guilty. It could have been possible that, with a lack of direct evidence, Cho might have escaped punishment. But thanks to the meticulous work of the police, this did not happen. Although the murder weapon was never found, the police are confident that Cho carefully hid it. However, even such a detailed plan could not save him from justice. The examination of the victim's stomach contents allowed the investigators to accurately determine the time of death, which became the key factor in solving the case. This case serves as a reminder that a criminal always leaves traces, no matter how hard they try to hide them. May Choi and her son's souls rest in peace after such a horrific and unjust death.